We got nice. Well, thanks so much, and take it away, Blake.
Of course, thank you, Adam. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Uh, Present if I can. Can you guys see everything? Excellent. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Blake. I am a first year. I'll be in Kirkland House next semester. Or I'm sorry. Yeah, next semester, the best house, obviously. Thinking of a concentration right now, a joint in classics and historical linguistics. So I figured I'd share with you some of the cool things that I think lie between those fields in the form of historical linguistics. So we'll be talking a lot about the methods that are used to learn about ancient languages, how they sounded. A lot of these methods allow us to do a lot of really interesting stuff even beyond that. You can see right here, the background image for this first slide is of the Proto-Indo-European family tree, which is the parent language, the language which Latin, English, Albanian, Hindi, all these languages go back to thousands of years ago. That's a language we can construct using the methods of historical linguistics. And I'm hoping I'll be able to share some of those methods with you today. So we're obviously all in the Harvard Linguistic Society, so we're familiar with what linguistics, simply as a study is. It's the study of language. Now, historical linguistics is the study of language and the studying of specific languages, throughout history, throughout time. We study how they worked. We study how they changed over the course of time. Excuse me, over the course of time while they were spoken. And if they're still around today, we study that series of change all the way up to how they're spoken today. So obviously, you've seen written languages that were spoken a really long time ago, like Latin or Sanskrit or ancient Greek, maybe, and they look significantly different from their modern counterparts. But it is still a fair question to raise, how much do languages really change over time? Is the English of today understandable with the English of 1,000 years ago? Your grandparents might speak a little bit different than you do, maybe some differences in like slang or things like that. But again, it's hard to see over the short term how those differences can arise in the long term. So in order to help illustrate this a little bit, I have right here a sample of the Old English language. The specific sample is taken from a manuscript from the 11th century. And yeah, Old English, the specific dialect spoken in like southwestern Britain in like 900s, 1000s. I don't have a title listed right here, but I do have a little segment I'd like to introduce called Guess the Text, where if anybody thinks they can look at this sample of English 1,000 years removed from today, can anyone tell what this text is?
Is it the Lord's Prayer?
It is the Lord's Prayer. Thank you, Ed. And I'm sorry, I forgot to say in the beginning, either feel free to raise your hands and Adam will call you out to me, or just unmute yourself to interrupt me. So yes, this is the Lord's Prayer, first translated into English, over 1,000 years ago. And this is one of those early versions. And, significantly different than how we would say the Lord's Prayer today, that's for sure. A reconstructed pronunciation of Old English would sound something like Fer ure fute arpum heavenum, sidin namige helrod. It's very different from how we would say it today. And if you just heard me say that little bit right there, it sounds like a completely different language. There are some similarities that you can pick out, if not from hearing it, at least from seeing it. Feder for the modern father, thu you might recognize in thou, ert, in art, heavenum, in heaven. There's a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences obscured by differences in vocabulary, differences in the writing system used to denote the spoken language, and differences in the spoken language itself as it was spoken. And on the time scale of 1,000 years, these differences are vast. Now, if we shift the time scale forward a little bit to the period of what we call Middle English, English as spoken during like the later Middle Ages. This sample from a translation of the Lord's Prayer from about 1380, it definitely looks a lot more similar, and you can probably catch, if not all of it, most of it from reading it. And even if it's recited aloud, it starts sounding a lot more similar to our modern language. It's something like Ure Father that art in heaven is, hallowed be thy name, the kingdom come to, and so on and so forth. It sounds a little bit like maybe like a Scottish accent of modern English nowadays. Um, and the spelling after the Norman conquest, spelling brought a lot in line with French, as in addition to a lot of French vocabulary introduced to English, which we still deal with today. So the Middle English period, we can see these differences start to compound into something that starts resembling our modern language more and more. Um, Fast forward a little bit in the ballpark of like 250 years later, we get into the territory of what we call early modern English. So technically the same as like modern English that I'm speaking right now, but a little bit in the very early period, in the parts where the great vowel shift was still going on, and the differences between Middle English and modern English were still being hammered out. And if you read this right here, this is from the King James Version, which I have a little extract of a woodcut from a printed edition from right there. It's a very famous English edition of the Bible, and compounded with the fact that it's technically in the same phase as our current spoken language. It's very easily understandable, especially because it's a text we're very familiar with. In addition, even if at the time of its writing it was pronounced a little bit different, something like "Ore Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, the kingdom come," and so on and so forth. So a little bit different, but the orthography is changing to be more in line with what we're familiar with nowadays. The sounds, the oo in what was in the Middle English ure that diphthong is broken a little bit. So instead of ure, it's our, which we might say our today. So, differences are starting to compound into what we might recognize as the modern language. And then, one of the standard translations of the Lord's Prayer from 1928, you can find it, basically any Bible you pick up nowadays. Our Father who art in heaven, and so on and so forth. So we look at all these different phases of English. We can see how in the very beginning of the language's recorded history, the Old English period, incomprehensible, basically, apart from a couple of words. Some certain words have continued to be used since the Old English period. So we see feather become father, become father, become modern father, things like that. Our, going back to our, going back to ure, going back to ure, things like that. There are also differences in vocabulary, however. This is one of the ways where languages change over time. So let me see if I can find a good example. So right here, thin riche. Riche is here used to translate, the ancient Greek word for kingdom. Whereas after the period of French influence, we start seeing a different word being used, kingdom to kingdom to kingdom in our modern word. Any other differences in vocabulary we might find right here, the word loaf in Old English being used to translate bread. This is used for our modern word loaf, like a loaf of bread, but we can see that right here in the Middle English version, bread, and then bread, and then bread. So, the word hlaf becomes more specialized in its meaning with a different word coming to take its place. So we talked about lexical differences, we talked about differences in pronunciation. The writing system itself is obviously very different. We don't use this character right here, known as thorn, anymore, which is to denote a th sound. We also don't use ev anymore. This sound right here, also used to denote a th sound. We don't use usually this little handy dandy ligature right here. A lot of differences. An F between vowels here actually makes a V sound. A lot of differences. And a lot of these differences start becoming more in line with what we're familiar with nowadays after the period of French influence. So lexical differences, differences in the sounds as they're said, the sounds as they're written down, and just differences in how we would, phrase things in accordance with syntax, things like that, differing in all this time. So yeah, we can take away some key points from this distinction. Language can, in fact, change drastically over time, and it happens at a level which, between generations, is pretty much almost imperceptible, apart from differences we might attribute to, like, slang, for instance. So, like, you and your parents might say a couple words differently from one another, and you might use a few words that, like, your parents don't use anymore, and your parents that you don't use anymore. But it's almost completely identical. It's a little more distinct between you and your grandparents speaking. If you have great grandparents or great great grandparents around, the differences would be even more so. And it's just like that over a period of thousands of years. That's basically how language changes over time. And these changes, as we've seen, are rooted in the spoken language, how the language is spoken. Writing systems, those are secondary to spoken language. Those are arbitrary ways of representing the spoken language that, apart from, like, people consciously trying to change the way they speak to reflect the writing system, that doesn't represent, natural language change at all. We in the Old English period used letters we don't even use anymore. I could start writing the English that I'm speaking right now in the Greek alphabet if I wanted to, with a couple of, additions to the Greek alphabet, and it would, represent the same, spoken language that I'm saying right now. It's completely arbitrary. Um, and the difficulty is when we're studying historical linguistics and we're interested in how ancient languages were spoken and pronounced, because that's the way that, like, Latin was spoken, or Sanskrit was spoken, or ancient Greek or Hittite was spoken. That's the character of the language itself. But a lot of the times, writing is all that we have. A Latin inscription, or a Sanskrit text written on palm leaf, or a Hittite inscription carved into a stone tablet. And it's our job to use the clues that these, written systems give us and these written mediums give us in order to make some deductions about how these languages themselves were spoken. It's a quick sip of water. There we go. So yes, it's an issue of sort of decoding how these languages are written in order to, figure out how they were spoken, and in this way to study, historical linguistics and how these languages have changed over time. And if we want to start going over some of the sources that we might use in historical linguistics, some of these written documents that we sort of have to parse for clues as to how these languages were actually spoken, very much so in Western Europe, we use manuscripts if we want to decipher, how Latin might have been spoken or how ancient Greek might have been spoken, for instance. So right here, this manuscript, it's a 7th or 8th century manuscript of a 3rd or 4th century text we call the Appendix Probae, which we'll talk about later. And I personally think this manuscript illustrates a lot of the issues with working with manuscripts. This right here is a palimpsest. A palimpsest is what we call a text that, so a manuscript has been, like, written with a certain text on it. That text is then rubbed down in order to, like, try to get rid of it, and then a new text is written over it. That's a palimpsest. So this right here is a palimpsest with the Appendix Probae written over something that we're not really sure what it is anymore because it's been written over. That might be used to, like, if like parchment is scarce or you don't want to care to read a certain text anymore, you might use a palimpsest in those cases. In addition, you can see right here on the 2 pages lots of, like, water stains. That's just, like, from poor treatment of the manuscript over time. You see the edges starting to fray, maybe some worms have eaten some holes right here in the top pages of this manuscript. Obviously, the handwriting from over 1,000 years ago was way different from how we would write something by hand nowadays. So manuscripts can be really hard to read in that respect. One of the really good things about manuscripts is that if the manuscript lineage goes back to an ancient text, if we have a manuscript of, like, the Aeneid, for instance, at least in theory, that manuscript tradition, one manuscript being copied from another, goes back all the way in time to the 1st century AD when the Aeneid was written, for instance. So manuscripts can be, incredibly valuable in that regard. And oftentimes there are only sources for what these ancient texts were, at least before the advent of printing, where these manuscripts, their text would have been copied and then mass produced via printing. But even in terms of the transmission of manuscripts from the ancient period, there can be a lot of issues. The manuscript, if a manuscript was written in France, for instance, and then it was taken over to Germany, and then you have a German scribe trying to read this French, this Latin manuscript written in France and try to transcribe it in Germany, the way their way of handwriting in France might be different than it is in Germany, so we might misidentify some letters and therefore some words by that. Lighting wasn't very good back then, so if you have a scribe with like very strained eyes reading this by candlelight, he might mistranscribe some words. In the cases where like someone was reading a manuscript aloud to someone else who was then transcribing it, we can have some issues in transmission in that regard as well, because someone might be like, oh, I would spell the Latin word etiam in my spoken language with like a C, like E-C-I-A-M, whereas in Latin, it's spelled E-T-I-A-M. So there might be a corruption of the manuscript in that regard. So there's a lot of issues with, using manuscripts to get samples of ancient languages. But in a lot of cases, these are our only sources. And so it's important to work through the difficulties because they can give us a lot of really important data. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. All right. So manuscripts might form like a consistent lineage from, let's say, the classical period to the modern, to the contemporary period of the manuscript. Maybe it's a manuscript of the Aeneid, which was originally composed in, the 1st century AD. It might be a manuscript dating from like the 9th century AD, for instance. But when we have samples of papyri, usually from the period of like Egypt or, modern day Israel, Palestine, the greater Near East, these can be really good sources of surviving examples of the text from when the text was written. Because, after like, the immediate post-classical period in like Egypt, people haven't really been writing on papyrus since then. So, this is like a primary source document in the truest sense of the word to like, in the case of the New Testament, the early Christian communities that were using these texts. And we actually have a sample of the New Testament right here. So this is Papyrus 66 of the Greek New Testament. It contains almost the entirety of the Gospel of John, and it dates to about 200 CE. So this is very exciting because it dates to maybe like 150 years after like, the postulated, career of Christ. So this is very interesting in order to get some insight into the linguistic character of these communities. A lot of the times with papyri, the writing can actually be fairly clear to read since you need to sort of stick to very simple character shapes with a, writing with a reed pen so as not to rip the papyrus. But the thing about papyri, we don't have a whole lot of them because they're very fragile for the same reason that you need to be careful while writing about them. In certain cases, this might be the only sample we have of a papyrus. And it's scholars' job to, parse as much meaning as they can out of this scrap of papyrus in order to tell what text this is depicting. So like very, intelligent, very smart, very educated biblical scholars can look at this and say that this is part of the Greek New Testament right here. This is Papyrus 52 from about 150 CE. I personally can only describe, really tell like a single word right here, udena, which means nobody. And this might be the word apon right here, which means like I said, but like I can't really tell you much more than that. So it takes a lot of training to look at these scraps of papyrus and sort of, deal with them in that regard. On the topic of sources that date back to the time of these texts actually being composed, inscriptions can be a really great example of this. So this right here is the Arch of Titus. It dates to the 1st century CE. It's from modern Rome, and it commemorates the Roman victory over the rebellion in the province of Palestine in the 1st century CE, the Jewish revolt. There's a lot of interesting, historical information we can get from it in that regard. And, it just serves as a really good example of a very clear Latin inscription. We have Senatus Populusque Romanos, the Senate and people of Rome, Divo Tito Divi Vespasiani, F, that F stands for filio, the divine Titus, son of the divine Vespasian, and then just some more epithets for Titus, Vespasiano, Vespasian Augusto, Augustus, the August. And this is just a really good example of a Latin inscription. And inscriptions are basically like some of the perfect examples for like, if we want to understand how like literary, perfectly standard classical Latin was written in the classical period. This is, again, in the truest sense of a word, a primary source document. This is exactly how the Romans wanted their language to be remembered. And this is some of our evidence for, reconstructing how the Romans wrote their language. The fact that inscriptions are depictions of such very like highbrow language, the language that was considered at the time the standard, the language worth preserving. That's really good if we want to talk about classical Latin, how Latin was written in like the 1st century CE. But if we're interested in how the common person spoke Latin in, the 1st century CE, it's less useful because the language of the common people in most cases wasn't really considered worth preserving. And in a lot of cases, the written language is sort of more archaizing. It's of a more archaic or old character than the written language, usually artificially so. And so that can be a little different if we want to reconstruct, for instance, Vulgar Latin, which is like the spoken Latin concurrently with the written standard of classical Latin. In addition, inscriptions can often be very formulaic. In this inscription, for instance, we don't even have a verb. It's just the Senate and people of Rome to the divine Titus, and so on and so forth. We can understand a word like the Senate and people of Rome made this for the divine Titus or made it in honor of the divine Titus, but it's very formulaic, standardized language, which again doesn't give us a lot of super precise linguistic information. But again, for understanding how standard literary classical Latin was written, for instance, or standard literary classical Greek, or even like standard literary classical Persian or things of that sort, you can't really get much better than inscriptions. On the flip side, another sort of way of scratching things into stone is, tablets. Tablets can take a lot of forms. They can be scraps or little tablets of marble, or maybe granite, or a lot of times baked clay. And the really interesting thing about tablets is that these are very accessible back when people wrote on tablets to the common person. This tablet right here, this is a British curse tablet, which is basically just like, how should you explain it? It's like if someone wronged you or someone stole something of yours, you might pay someone to have this inscription on this tablet drafted up, and you might, lay it at the shrine of a goddess with the aim that the goddess will exact retribution for you from whoever wronged you, whether you know who they are or not. And because this was this was used as in the medium of like petty theft, for instance, this is pretty good, actually a pretty good example of like, or at least a better example than, monumental inscriptions of how the normal person who spoke Latin actually spoke Latin. They can, the thing with, tablets like this, they can be a little hard to read because you're literally trying to decipher, scratchings onto stone or clay. The language here can be formulaic as well. So that's something else to keep in mind. And, there can be some errors even in the formula. So I personally have read curse tablets that have just been completely ungrammatical because the lower educated scribe made like a mistake in transcribing from memory the formula of the curse onto the tablet. So you sort of have to interpret what they really meant by that too. But in some cases, these errors actually reflect not just like a lapse in memory of the formula, but actual developments in the spoken language from the literary standard. So tablets in general, and like the curse tablets very famously from Vindolanda, Britain, these can be very useful indicators of how the common person spoke the language and had their spoken language written down. Take a quick sip of water. And yes, all of these documents can help us answer the question that we're trying to answer, which is how do we know how ancient languages sounded? You might use manuscripts, inscriptions, papyri, tablets. All these things are things we have to, parse for clues in order to say, for example, in the examples I'll be talking about, because those are the examples I'm most familiar with, how Latin and ancient Greek were spoken. So let's dive into it. So how do we know how these languages were spoken? A lot of different ways. The spelling system itself can oftentimes shed light on how we think these languages were pronounced. How the spelling system was leveraged in order to create puns, or how the spelling system was used in order to depict onomatopoeia. So like using language to depict like sounds like bang or thwap or something like that. We can also get some information about loan words from a certain language appearing in another language, how the second language chose to use its writing system to depict the word from the first language. This can tell us some information about the first language if we know a particular point about how the second language was written. Sometimes, and this is a pretty fun example, sometimes in the instance of like pitch accented language or languages with musical pitch or tone, we can actually use musical evidence in order to get some evidence for how this tone worked. We'll talk about that with relation to ancient Greek. We can also see how alternate spellings appear in epigraphy, which is inscriptions, as we talked about, and also numismatics, which is like coins, and inscriptions as inscribed into coins. Alternate spellings are sort of like acceptable. There are also, spellings that are considered unacceptable at the time of their writing, misspellings. These appear a lot of the time in manuscripts and papyri. These appear in graffiti, and these actually appear in like grammarians' complaints about the ways people are speaking or writing their language. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the form of the appendix probi. And we can also get some clues about how ancient languages were spoken in the way that their modern descendants are spoken, and sort of working backwards from there. So we will start right now, excuse me, with a look into the spelling system itself. So I'm bringing up again the Arch of Titus inscription because it's a very clear Latin inscription. And if we look closely at this inscription, what we notice is that we only see 5 vowels depicted. We see, can I zoom in? I can zoom in a little bit. There we go. We can see an E, an A, and a U in the Senatus. We can even find an O right here in Romanos. We can even find an I right here in Divo. And if you look closely, you'll notice those are the only 5 vowels that you see in this inscription. You don't even see a Y in here, even though Y was used to depict some Greek loanwords. We won't worry about that for now. In 99% of the Latin you see, all you see is A, E, I, O, and U, or in a more like continental pronunciation, A, E, O, U. And, just basically off this firsthand, assessment of, the Latin spelling system, we can see this corresponds to like how we would represent a modern 5 vowel system in Spanish, modern Greek, Hebrew, any number of languages that use this system. The character A for A, the character E for E, O, U, and so on. And, in addition to other evidence, obviously, this can just be used to get like at first glance assessment of how a language is written down. It can give us some useful information, however, especially in terms of older languages, like in this case, classical Latin. By the time classical Latin had been cemented as a written standard, that's about the time that like the alphabet really took its modern shape that we're familiar with today. So if the alphabet was pretty much, the classical Latin alphabet was pretty much invented along with classical Latin, when we read classical Latin, we can be pretty sure that, it's not going to be too out there. There's not going to be a whole lot of historical spelling. We're probably not going to find a lot of silent letters, for instance, things like that. This is in stark contrast to our modern languages, which have been using these spelling systems for thousands of years. And there's a lot of differences. A lot of silent letters in modern English. A modern English A is not used at all to represent, in most cases, an A, except for like after W. It's usually an A, an E for an E, not an I for an I, not an E, and so on and so forth. So, and it's the same way with like French or Irish, any of these languages. The spelling system can diverge a lot over time, but way back in the forever ago when it's first being used, it's probably not going to diverge too much from what it actually appears to be representing. We can also take some other takeaways from like the Latin spelling system, at least. So you might have heard before, or you might be familiar with in another context, maybe studying Latin, that the Latin V, as written in like modern textbooks, is actually pronounced like a W. So not like veni, vidi, vici, but like veni, vidi, vici, for instance. And that might be a little confusing because like it's written in our textbooks with a V, so like why shouldn't we say it like a V? Well, the thing to note is that in classical Latin, all the letters were the capital letters. Our modern lowercase or minuscule letters weren't, devised and didn't come into use until, the really late post-classical period or the earlier medieval period. If we look at, for instance, the Arch of Titus one more time, we see this is all capital letters. You won't find any lowercase letters in a Roman inscription dating to the classical period because they didn't exist yet. And we can see this V, the V character, the single uppercase V character, where we know it has to stand for a U. You might see Julius Caesar written with V's. It's not depicting Julius Caesar or anything like that. We know it has to be Julius Caesar based on historical evidence and just, even how these words come into us in the modern languages. And we can see this even, for instance, in the Arch of Titus inscription. We see this last word right here, Augustus. We know it's Augustus, not Augustus. Just, based on logic, there'd be a very difficult consonant cluster or syllabic consonant to realize, and things along that line. Thus, when we find a consonantal version of the character V in classical Latin, it's probably just denoting the consonantal version of U, because we know it denotes U as a basic vocalic value. And the consonantal version of U is W. So, in diphthongs, it's not Augustus, it's Augustus. That's just sort of an intuition that we can make. And based on other evidence that we won't really get into right now, we can tell that it's true. So again, in a lot of cases, the spelling system itself can give us some really useful information about how a language was spoken. Also useful for, sort of parsing a writing system for how language is spoken is puns and onomatopoeia, or like, word sounds, bang, crash, thwap. I won't really get into onomatopoeia in this instance because it's a little complicated, but puns can be very easily understood. So there's a very famous pun in Latin from the story of Crassus, the member of the first triumvirate, departing Brundisium for Parthia to campaign against the Parthians. And as he's leaving the port at Brundisium, there's this merchant right here. He's selling figs, and the Latin word for this type of fig is a caunea. And so he's shouting kauneas, kauneas, the plural version, that he's selling figs. And according to this very popular story, in this word kauneas, if Crassus had actually been paying attention to what was being shouted as he was leaving Brundisium, he would have actually understood that he shouldn't have departed for Parthia, because Parthia is where he would die. And he would have understood this because if he'd taken a moment to listen to kauneas, he would have actually heard a hidden warning, kaue ne eas. And in Latin, this means like don't leave, basically. Literally, it's like, beware that you not depart. So it's basically the merchant's actually telling him, don't leave for Parthia. Um, and this pun can be very insightful for the issue again of the pronunciation of V in classical Latin. Um, because in order for this pun to work, the AU diphthong that we see in kauneas, we know it's pronounced ow. We know it's not pronounced av or anything like that. And in order for this pun to work, there's a couple of things that need to happen. This e right here in kawe needs to drop off, and then these two e's in ne eas need to just sort of get merged together. And then just those two short changes are made, and then this pun works perfectly. This pun wouldn't work perfectly if when a V is representing a consonant, it's representing the consonant va. So like no one could reasonably understand Crassus to understand kauneas uh, as representing kavneas, two completely different sounds. So this pun again can only work again if the Latin V actually represents a W in a consonantal position, and therefore this just adds evidence to the pile that the Latin V actually represented as a consonant what we'd now say a W. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. And I mentioned briefly earlier loan words and how those can be a little insightful into our understanding of how a language was spoken. And we have this ancient Greek word right here that I'll hold off on pronouncing, at least for right now, in order to make the point. In modern Greek, you read this philosophia, and that's the modern Greek word for philosophy. We see this in English right here with a PH indicating these, interesting characters that I've underlined right there. That's called a phi. And that too we pronounce as an F. So going off of this evidence, you'd be like, well, okay, that's a bunch of different sources for this character phi being pronounced as an F. So the ancient Greeks probably pronounced it as an F too, right? That doesn't actually hold up for a lot of reasons, a lot of which are very complicated. But what we'll get into right now is just that when the ancient Romans took the word philosophy into their language, they had a perfectly good character F that could represent an F sound if this existed in ancient Greek. And they didn't choose this F sound to represent it. They chose a PH consonant, a graphic consonant cluster, in order to represent a sound that, because PH exists only in ancient Greek loanwords into Latin, this sound probably only existed in ancient Greek and wasn't native to Latin. And because the F sound is native to Latin, this chain of intuition, this probably wasn't pronounced as an F. And in fact, by a lot of different, very thorough historical linguistic evidence, we can conclude that the ancient Greek phi character actually represented what we call a voiceless aspirated consonant, a p, that you might hear in like the English word pin as opposed to spin, a very aspirated p in pin as opposed to an unaspirated sp in spin. And this is one example of how the usage and the analysis of loan words can help us make such an intuition, or at least add evidence to this intuition. Also on the note of ancient Greek, well, first necessary is to say that ancient Greek had a pitch accent, where on a certain syllable, the musical pitch at which you said the syllable, versus actually contributed to the meaning of the utterance. We know, even from like the commentary of like contemporary grammarians that it had a pitch accent. And we even have in surviving Byzantine manuscripts from like the medieval period, we actually have depictions of accent marks that are supposed to be depicting this pitch accent. And in these Byzantine manuscripts, if we zoom in a little bit, this is Iliados, this is the Iliad right here. We see right here the three sorts of accent marks that were used. We see this right here in altar, this right here with like sort of like a down slash, that's called a grave. We see right here in cosme, and then I can't really read the rest of that. We see that accent right here. That's an acute accent with the slash going upward. And we see right here in pro, this sort of like, it's bending around on top of the character in question. So we call that a circumflex, literally bending around accent. So if we look this in like a modern font, this is an acute accent, this is a grave, and this is a circumflex. And the logical question is, how on earth do we parse these accents for meaning when we're trying to decipher musical pitch? How is that at all possible? It seems like it'd be only guesswork based on like the graphic character of these. Maybe there's like a modulation in the tone coming into play with the circumflex accent. Maybe there's like a lowering of the tone with the grave and like a raising of some sort. We can't really tell. But this is one of the cases where musical evidence actually can help us make some insights into this issue. So we'll be talking right now about the Psycholos epitaph, which is a very cool document. It's actually like a marble like pillar or statue right here, dates to the 1st or 2nd century CE. There's an inscription on here. And if you zoom in on this inscription, this first right here is a pretty basic like funerary text. We think this is used to like as a monument to some man's dead wife. It's talking about how this is a monument with for the undying memory. It itself being a long-lasting monument. But then this part right here is actually ancient Greek musical notation. If you zoom in, it's not at all like modern musical notation. These marks right here that we see above the vowels and the consonants are denoting the differences in like the musical pitch of the song as a whole. And very intelligent modern scholars are can like read the ancient grammarians' descriptions of how this musical notation system worked, and can actually give us some modern staff notation like this. And it's very interesting because this forms a full piece of music. And this is actually, I believe, our earliest example of like a full piece of music from the ancient world. And I'm going to take a quick sip of water before I uh, actually sing the melody for you, and then we can talk about how the melody can give us some insights on the ancient Greek pitch accent. So, and this is a sort of post-classical Greek inscription. So in this sort of post-classical Greek manner of pronunciation, it'd be like, O sonzis phenu mirinolosilipu prosoligon estitosen totilos chronos apeti. And we have right here on our modern staff notation, the text going along with it, we have our accent marks right there from what we know from the inscription. So if we look at the accent marks and see if we can correlate some, accent mark to a certain modulation in the musical pitch that we find in the staff notation, we can make some insights into the character of the ancient Greek pitch accent. So I think this is very clear to see in the circumflex accent in this text, at least mostly. We see right here, it starts high, low in this instance. Let's see if we can see that again. Titozi, again, high, low with the circumflex accent. And then this is a very good high, low right here. Apeti, that goes all the way down to circumflex right here. In every case, except for one case in the beginning where there's not really, we don't see that the circumflex in the beginning, but at least the preponderance of the evidence in this staff notation lets us make the insight that if we go on to the next page, the circumflex accent in ancient Greek started high and then went low. We would call this in modern, linguistics a falling accent. If we look at how the acute accent correlates with the musical pitch, and we see right here, oh, sonzis phenu, we see the acute accent correlating with a rise in the pitch over this entire diphthong. And this gives us some instance that in the case of long vowels or diphthongs, this was a rising accent over the course of the syllable. We can see even right in the case of short vowels, it looks like my video has stopped working. There we go. We see this in the case of short vowels, how even in short vowels, where there's not really enough time in the vowel for the pitch to rise much, when it's accented with the acute, the pitch is actually higher than the rest of the utterance we can see. And we see right here, meeting olos, the o being, higher pitched than the los. We see this right here, prosoligon, no, oligon, higher than the rest of the utterance. And then we see to telos o kronos, again, higher than the rest of the utterance. And then there's really not a whole lot of information to garner from the the grave accent in this piece. And this is one of the pieces of evidence that leads us to believe that the grave, it's actually even in, synchronically, the ancient Greek writing system, it's usually just used as like, oh, whoops, apologies. It's usually just used to represent the acute accent in different circumstances. So we think it's probably just another way of writing the acute accent, or maybe it was like a level. I have low written here, but actually there's not a whole lot. It's not really commonly considered that it was a low accent. It's probably just a level accent. But yes, even things like musical pitch in a language, which we have no hope of, knowing just from reading a text in ancient Greek. We can use musical evidence actually to interpret what this pitch probably sounded like. And I think that's a really, cool example of that. Turning back to spelling systems, alternate spellings in like inscriptions and coins, which are considered like the gold standard of the literary language. This can tell us a lot about what was considered an acceptable, alteration in spelling at the time of its writing in the highest caliber of the language. And this can tell us some interesting stuff about at least the character, the phonetic character of the spoken language. So in older Latin inscriptions, in classical Latin inscriptions, we have this word consul, as we probably say it in English nowadays, which was the high elected office in ancient Rome. And the abbreviation for consul in classical Latin is COS. Now, why isn't it something like CONS? Why does this N drop out in this instance? Well, what actually happens is that in Latin, an N before a fricative, like here an S, it nasalizes the preceding vowel and actually lengthens the preceding vowel and then is lost. In an instance of compensatory lengthening, the nasal is lost and then, nasalized and lengthens the preceding vowel. And so this practice, this being the very common practice and the completely acceptable practice of noting the word consul in Latin, this serves as some evidence that, our intuition from other sources of evidence that the vowel, this O actually would be like a consul, actually like a consul. This is some evidence for that fact. Whoopsies. And, again, tells us a little bit more about the spoken language. We can see this right here in the inscription on Hadrian's Pantheon. We can see right here that Marcus Agrippa, the son of Lucius, I believe, when he was consul for the third time, made this. We can also see this in coins. This is hard to read, not super high resolution, sorry about that. But if you can see this pillar right here on this coin from Emperor Philip's third consulate, we can see the COS again. And this is even at a point where probably in the spoken language, the O probably wasn't even nasalized anymore. It was probably just consul. But even so, this standard has been cemented into the standard language and remains so for very long afterward. So that is to talk about alternate spellings that are acceptable in the written language. We can also garner some interesting stuff from misspellings, spellings that actually weren't considered the standard and were actually considered a sign of like lower education. And these can actually be very common in like, you know, sub-literary texts because most people didn't really have a lot of education, if at all. The proper way of being educated in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where you got the full brunt of like grammatical instruction and orthographical instruction, learning how things were supposed to be spelt, that was available to very few people. And so if you didn't have access to that, you had to spell things basically by sounding it out. And in a lot of cases, it actually worked pretty okay because these writing systems were still, sort of in their infancy, and hadn't diverged a whole lot from the spoken language, or rather, the spoken language hadn't diverged a whole lot from the standard of the writing system when the writing system was first devised. But in the later, like post-classical period, we can start to see the system fall apart. We can see this very commonly in ancient Greek papyri. For instance, this is very common in manuscripts. While we talk about papyri here, very common in the biblical papyri, like of the nature that I gave you some examples of before, papyrus 66. So in classical Greek, this iota character right here denoted an e. And then in very early, probably pre-classical Greek that should be written, this denoted an a diphthong and eventually an a, it monophthongized into. And so that by the period of modern Greek, these are actually synonymous, homophonous, with an iota representing an e, and then epsilon iota diphthong, digraph, also representing an e. And when we examine Codex Sinaiticus, which is a mid-4th century CE uncial codex of the Greek New Testament, one of the great uncial codices, in fact, we can start to see some instances of these sounds actually being confused for one another. So, for example, this word right here, right below the Codex Sinaiticus point on this slide, you can see, what might appear to be pronounced alethenon, as written in Codex Sinaiticus, when in fact there actually should be another character in between the lambda and the theta there, my apologies. There should actually be spelled not with an epsilon iota diphthong, but rather just with a plain iota. And this tells us, well, wait a minute, if people are confusing an epsilon iota for an iota, this means they were probably pronounced, if not similarly, the same. And this can give us some information that by the mid-4th century CE, this change had actually taken place, at least in certain environments, of the epsilon iota diphthong being used to represent an E. And what does that tell us? That the sound that this diphthong was being used to represent, the A or the A, had by that point, raised itself to be of the same quality as the regular E. And this is just a picture of Codex Sinaiticus. It's a really big book, and it's very big. It has almost the entire Greek Bible. And if you're at all interested in ancient Greek linguistics, historical linguistics, or biblical studies, this is a very cool website to go on, codexsinaiticus.org, where you can see images of Codex Sinaiticus. You can see some transcription of the codex, and you can even see translation of it. And I bring this up right here just to show you where in the text you can find it. This is actually John 1. Right here. Aleithenon, right here. And again, in classical Greek, excuse me, it looks like my video has been frozen again. In classical Greek, this would have been written with simply an iota, not an epsilon iota. But we can see here that this change in pronunciation change in spelling has taken place, probably reflecting the same change in pronunciation. We can see, for example, in Papyrus 66, which I mentioned to you earlier, we don't see alethenon, alethenon, yes, confused with being like alethenon. And so this tells us that, maybe in the early 2nd century, around 200 CE, when Papyrus 66 was written, maybe this distinction still was being upheld, but that by the time of the mid fourth century, it was no longer being upheld. Or maybe it was just an more educated scribe, um, who just knew the proper spelling. Maybe you have to make some judgment calls there if you want to sort of note the relative chronology of these sound changes. Um, and so it's something that scholars work, very hard on. And if I can move forward in my presentation, we also see some misspellings that can be very interesting. A lot of these with Latin come from Pompeii, with a lot of graffiti preserved there right before the eruption. We see the famous opening line of the Aeneid, "Arma virumque cano Troiae," and then so on. We see these R's represented among the Pompeii graffiti in a certain example, not as R's, but as L's, which is very interesting. So we see "Alma virumque cano Troiae." We understand that to continue. And that's very interesting. And whoops, we know from some other evidence that this sort of reflects a pronunciation in Oscan, which was a related language neighboring to like Rome and native to the area of Pompeii. And we can understand this to be actually an instance of someone's dialect influencing their written Latin, which doesn't happen a lot because Latin is so standardized around the written standard of Rome itself. And so it's very cool when you can pick these things out. And I haven't been able to find the actual Alma Volumque graffito, a line drawing or a picture anywhere. But these are some other line drawings of Arma Virumque and some, ancient Roman shorthand or handwriting systems. And it was a very common phrase to see written down. It might be compared to today's "to be" or "not to be" from Shakespeare's Hamlet. Even if you're not super familiar with like the plot of Hamlet, you probably know that quote. It's probably the same way for people in ancient Rome, at least in Pompeii back then, which is why we see it written down so much. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. And we also see in like the category of misspellings, grammarians' complaints can be very insightful. So I talked about the Appendix Probi earlier. I showed you that manuscript. It's a 3rd or 4th century, list of spelling mistakes basically, and their corrections. And spelling mistakes, as we've talked about, are usually reflective of like a change in the spoken language that the writing system hasn't caught up to yet. The writing system is usually, sort of frozen in place from an earlier period, but that doesn't stop the spoken language from changing, obviously. And so we have what in proper classical Latin of like the 1st century BCE was written probably like was written "winea" and was probably pronounced "winea." And in modern Spanish, we see this written as "so" and then pronounced as something like "piña." And in the Appendix Probi, we see an example where he says that like it's literally "winea," not "winia." Um, Pretty easy to see right there what the point is. The point being that you should write this as "winea," not "winia," um, for purposes of education. But the fact that people were confusing, "winia" for like the proper written form of "winea," what that tells us is that a certain change was taking place where people were confusing generally these two sounds and therefore didn't know when to write which for which. They sounded the same to them. And we can therefore see that there was probably like an intermediate form um, of between "winea" and "binia" that sounded something like "vinia" or maybe like "vinia," um, something of that sort. The point being that from these grammarians' complaints, we get some insight into spelling mistakes that people made that reflected changes in the spoken language. Yes, and here is again the manuscript of Appendix Probi that I showed you earlier. I again just find it utterly fascinating how absolutely ill-treated this manuscript is, but again, it's our only surviving manuscript of the Appendix Probi. And so we have to sort of do our best to read it, even though it's very not easy. And this example uh, that we were just talking about from the appendix probi. This is a very good point to talk about the regularity of sound change, which is a very important concept in historical linguistics. So, once we identify an environment in which a sound change takes place, we can actually generalize that this sound change always takes place in that environment, as long as we state the environment correctly. This comes from so much empirical evidence because, just on the face of it, it seems like something that can't really be tested except for trying to find exceptions to it. And we can't really find exceptions to it except on the basis of analogy, which I'll talk about in a second. And you might also see this referred to as the neo-grammarian hypothesis. So, for example, I'll tell you, we know that this sound change, where like INEA becomes from Latin into Spanish and NNA, a winea becoming Spanish biña. So I have a question for you actually. If we have a Latin linea written and pronounced as so, according to the principle of regularity of sound change, how might we expect this to be like pronounced or written in modern Spanish? Can anybody tell me?
Linya.
Exactly, because it's the same exact thing, right? Winea, viña, sorry, biña, linea becoming linea. That's the beauty of regularity of sound change. There is an important exception, not really an exception to sound change in itself, but an exception to like when we see sound change, actually survive over time. This is called analogy. Analogy is when you take a paradigm that sort of has exceptions to it linguistically that really don't seem like they should exist, and you apply a more common you basically take the point from a paradigm which is very common and which this other paradigm seems like it should adhere to, and you basically make that in line with the general paradigm, the most common one. It's a little complicated to explain. An example of this will really help. So in Proto-West Germanic, we have bulk and its plural bulkies. Due to the process of umlaut, by the time of Old English, this becomes bulk, and then this O actually gets fronted to an E, sorry, an E, and then later gets raised a bit to an A, and then don't worry about the consonant changes for now. By the time of Middle English, this sound is raised even more into, I'm sorry, it stayed the same in Middle English. It raises later in Modern English. So again, we see the same paradigm though surviving in Middle English with bulk and beach. And then in Modern English though, even in very early Modern English, we see book and then books. Hold on a minute, that there's no way for beach to become books on the basis solely of sound change. What the heck happened here? Again, this is analogy we'll talk about. I just came up with, the first 5 words that came into my head and I tried to make the plural form. Cake, you make the plural form cakes. Bed, beds. Carrot, carrots. Table, tables. Basket, baskets. It's completely unreasonable for the plural of book to be beach, even if on the basis of sound change, that's what it should be like regularly throughout its history. But no, when analogy comes place, an analogy, people make the conscious sort of decision to impose this paradigm onto the sort of deviant paradigm. Or it might sort of be an underlying thing where you might just forget that the plural of book is beach. The fact that like in more common words that are like said more often, you use them more often and therefore you're familiar with the forms very thoroughly. This is where forms that seem irregular can actually survive for a long time. So for example, the word child, we have an old plural forming suffix in the plural children that's actually survived into today because child is an exceedingly common word, and therefore everyone knows the plural of child is children. In other instances with other more I don't want to say exotic, but with other less common words, you might not be super familiar with what the plural is right off the bat if it's in a regular plural. And so you just make it in line with all your other plural words. It's a very, very easily understandable thing to do. And it doesn't form so much of an exception to sound change as just an exception to when we see sound change, we see its effects into the later stages of language. And I also have right here an example from the King James Version of the Bible, which we saw earlier as an example of early modern English. Psalm 86:17, show me a token for good that they which hate me may see it and be ashamed, because thou, Lord, hast holpen me and comforted me. Holpen here, you might not be familiar with it, so I'll tell you. This is the old past participle of the word help. So just as the old past participle of the word melt was molten, this old paradigm was like melt is to molten as help is to holpen, excuse me. Um, but this is almost completely out there. We only see molten in modern context as like, molten lava, or like, that's really all I can think of, molten lead, maybe a molten lava cake or something like that. Um, there is no such context in when we see Holpen survive into modern English. And so this is sort of illustrative of the fact that we can see analogy takes place with basically any lexical item. It can be verbs, it can be nouns, it can take the form of like appending or changing suffixes, it can take the form of like changing the internal structure of the word, as we see with both beach becoming book and then holpen becoming helped. Um, Analogy can take place in all these contexts because people want to make the language, more in line with what they feel it should be on a conscious level, even though on a subconscious level, over generations, the undercurrent of sound change is always taking place. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you all for coming and listening. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. So let me stop sharing right here.
I just want to say that was incredibly well put together. Like one of the most thorough we've seen so far, and that's it was really interesting. I really like the 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 tablet from Britain with the
Mhm.
insults on it, curse, and the musical pitch thing with ancient Greek is so cool. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, that reminds me of a certain thing with the British curse tablets. There's literally a website with like all these curse tablets from Vindolanda. You can find pictures of them. They're transcribed, they're translated. It's really cool. It's almost like actual vulgar Latin, which is very interesting. So let me see if I can find this website real quick and put it in the chat.
Yeah, I'll send it over the email list too.
Leave this, yes, curse tablets of Roman Britain. Very cool. Put that in the chat right here.
Thank you.
Of course.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much.